I never thought feeding a few cats behind my house in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, would lead to the most absurd legal battle of my life. But here I was, staring at a $500 fine from my homeowners association. My name is Isaac Quinn, and I had been living in the Sunridge Springs community for about 3 years. The neighborhood was one of those cookie-cutter developments that sprouted up in the Chandler area, with beige stucco houses, red tile roofs, and an HOA that seemed to have nothing better to do than measure the height of everyone's grass with a ruler. I worked as a software engineer from home, which meant I had a lot more time to notice the comings and goings in the neighborhood than most people. The whole thing started about 6 months ago, when I noticed a few cats hanging around the retention pond behind my property. At first, I thought they were just neighborhood cats doing their thing, but after talking with my neighbor Jerry, I learned these cats were actually part of a program run by the Desert Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The center had been working in the area for years, managing feral cat colonies to prevent them from decimating the local bird population while also keeping the rodent problem under control. I had always been an animal lover, growing up with dogs and cats in my childhood home in Michigan. When I moved to Arizona for work, my landlord at the time did not allow pets, and even after buying this house, my travel schedule made it impractical to have animals of my own. Helping these cats seemed like a perfect way to connect with animals without the full commitment of pet ownership. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had explained everything to me when I first reached out to them. These cats were part of a trap, neuter, return program. They had all been fixed, vaccinated, and ear-tipped for identification. The center provided the food, and volunteers like me just had to put it out at consistent times. It was not feeding strays in the traditional sense. It was participating in a legitimate wildlife management program that had the blessing of the county. I had been doing this for months without any issues. Every evening at 6, I would take the food the center provided to the designated feeding station behind my house, near the wash. The cats would come, eat, and disappear back into the desert landscape. It was peaceful, and I enjoyed watching them from my back patio while sipping my evening coffee. Then Patricia Morrison happened. Patricia was the HOA president, a woman in her mid-50s with a blonde bob that never moved in the wind, and an expression that looked like she had been sucking on lemons for the better part of a decade. She drove a white Mercedes SUV and had appointed herself the neighborhood's moral guardian. I had managed to avoid her radar for the most part, keeping my yard pristine and my house the exact shade of beige that the HOA guidelines required. But apparently, my luck had run out. The notice came on a Thursday afternoon, stuffed into my mailbox in a crisp white envelope with the HOA logo embossed on the front. I remember opening it while standing in my driveway, still in my workout clothes from my morning run. The letter was typed in that officious font that bureaucrats love, detailing my supposed violation. According to the notice, I had been observed feeding stray animals on multiple occasions, which violated Section 7.3 of the HOA covenants and restrictions. The fine was $500, due within 30 days. Failure to pay would result in additional fines and potential legal action. I stood there in the Arizona heat, sweat dripping down my back, reading the letter 3 times to make sure I was understanding it correctly. There was no mention of the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, no acknowledgement that this was anything other than some random guy tossing scraps to strays. The letter made it sound like I was running a soup kitchen for raccoons, or something equally absurd. My first instinct was to call the center. I went inside, blasting the air conditioning, and dialed the number from my contacts, A woman named Dr. Sarah Chen answered. She was the director of the center and had been my main contact throughout the volunteer process. I explained the situation, reading her the entire letter verbatim. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Dr. Chen sighed, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "This is not the first time we have dealt with an HOA situation," she said, her voice tired but professional. "We have all the documentation you will need. The cats are registered with the county as part of our TNR program. We have permits, health records, everything. I will email you a packet within the hour that you can forward to your HOA board." "Will that be enough?" I asked, already sensing the answer. "In a rational world, yes, Doctor." Chen replied. "But HOAs do not always operate rationally. Be prepared for pushback. Some of these boards see any deviation from their rules as a personal affront. I have seen them fight legitimate wildlife programs just because they did not like the idea of cats near their properties." She was not wrong. I received the documentation packet as promised. It was comprehensive, over 40 pages of permits, county approvals, veterinary records, and scientific studies about the benefits of TNR programs. I compiled everything into a single PDF, wrote a polite but firm email explaining the situation, and sent it to the HOA board's general email address. Then I waited. 3 days passed without a response. I continued my evening feeding routine, now hyper-aware that I might be watched. I spotted Patricia driving slowly past my house twice during that time, her head craning to look at my backyard. Once, I even waved at her. She did not wave back. On the 4th day, I received a response, not from Patricia directly, but from the HOA's attorney, a man named Robert Fitzgerald from a law firm in Scottsdale. The email was brief and dismissive. According to Mr. Fitzgerald, the documentation I provided was irrelevant because the HOA covenants made no exception for any type of animal feeding, regardless of the legitimacy of the program. The covenants were clear, and I was in violation. The fine stood. I read that email sitting at my kitchen table, my morning coffee going cold beside me. The arrogance of it stunned me. They had not even tried to engage with the facts. It was pure power play, a display of authority for authority's sake. I called Dr. Chen again. "They are stonewalling," I told her. "Their lawyer says the covenants trump everything, including county programs." "That is not legally accurate," Dr. Chen said. She sounded angry now, which was somehow reassuring. "County ordinances and state law supersede HOA covenants. They cannot prohibit participation in a county-approved wildlife management program. That would be like them trying to ban you from putting out recycling bins because they do not like the color." "So, what do I do?" "You need your own lawyer," she said bluntly. "And you need to file a formal complaint with the county. The HOA is interfering with a sanctioned wildlife program, which is actually a violation on their end. I will support you however I can. We will testify, provide expert witnesses, whatever you need." I had never sued anyone in my life. The thought of legal action made my stomach churn. But the alternative was letting Patricia and her cronies steamroll me into abandoning cats that depended on regular feeding schedules. These were not just random strays, they were part of a managed colony. If I stopped feeding them, the center would have to scramble to find another volunteer, disrupting the program and potentially the cat's welfare. I started researching lawyers that afternoon. I needed someone who understood both HOA law and wildlife regulations. After making about a dozen calls, I found an attorney named Michelle Torres who had experience with HOA disputes and seemed genuinely interested in my case. We met at her office in downtown Chandler 2 days later. Michelle was in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and an office filled with case files that reached nearly to the ceiling. She listened to my entire story without interrupting, occasionally taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and tapped her pen against her lips. "This is actually a really interesting case," she said. "HOAs have a lot of power, but they are not above the law. If you are participating in a county-approved program, the HOA cannot fine you for it. The problem is that most people do not fight back. They pay the fine, stop whatever they were doing, and move on. The HOA is counting on you doing the same thing." "I am not going to do that," I said. "Good," Michelle smiled. "Because I think we can not only get this fine dismissed, but we might also be able to force some policy changes in your HOA. They need to learn they cannot bully people who are following the law." We discussed her fees, which made me wince but seemed reasonable given the circumstances. I signed a retainer agreement, and Michelle immediately went to work. She drafted a formal response to the HOA, attached all the documentation from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, and cited the specific county ordinances and state laws that protected my activities. She also filed a complaint with the county's Animal Services Department, alerting them that the HOA was interfering with a sanctioned program. The response from the HOA came faster this time, probably because they realized I had lawyered up. Robert Fitzgerald sent Michelle a lengthy email arguing that the covenants were a private agreement between homeowners and superseded county ordinances. He claimed the HOA board had the authority to regulate any activity within the community, including wildlife feeding. Michelle laughed when she read it to me over the phone. "He is wrong, but he knows that," she said. "This is posturing. They are trying to intimidate you into backing down. The legal precedent is not on their side at all. There are multiple cases in Arizona where courts have ruled that HOAs cannot prohibit activities that are protected by state or county law. So what happens next? We wait for them to either back down or escalate," Michelle said. "My guess is they will escalate. HOA boards hate admitting they are wrong. It might go to mediation, or possibly even court if they are really stubborn." She was right about the escalation. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. These meetings were technically open to all homeowners, though in practice, almost no one attended. I decided I needed to be there, both to defend myself and to see exactly who I was dealing with. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a bland building near the front entrance that also housed a small gym and a pool that no one used. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing khakis and a button-down shirt, trying to look respectable and reasonable. The clubhouse meeting room was set up with a long table at the front for the board members and several rows of folding chairs for attendees. When I walked in, only 3 other people were there, all older residents I recognized by sight but did not know personally. They looked at me with mild curiosity but said nothing. The board members started filtering in around 7. Patricia was easy to spot, of course, her blonde helmet of hair catching the fluorescent light. She was followed by 4 other board members. A balding man in his 60s named Harold, 2 women in their 50s named Deborah and Linda, and a younger guy, maybe in his late 30s, named Craig, who always seemed uncomfortable with the whole HOA business. Patricia took her seat at the center of the table and arranged her papers with exaggerated precision. She did not look at me, though I was sitting in the front row, directly in her line of sight. The meeting started with the usual boring business: approval of last month's minutes, financial report, discussion of landscaping contracts. I waited through 20 minutes of tedium before they finally reached new business. Patricia cleared her throat, glancing down at her papers. "We have an ongoing violation issue with one of our residents," she began, her voice taking on a theatrical quality like she was addressing a courtroom instead of a nearly empty meeting room. "Mr. Quinn has been repeatedly feeding stray animals in violation of our community covenants." I raised my hand. "I would like to address that." Patricia looked annoyed. "There will be time for resident comments at the end of the meeting." "This directly concerns me," I said, keeping my voice level. "I think I should be able to respond." Craig, the younger board member, leaned forward. "I think we should let him speak, Patricia. It is only fair." Patricia's jaw tightened, but she nodded stiffly. "Fine, Mr. Quinn, you have 3 minutes." I stood up, holding a folder with copies of all my documentation. "I am not feeding stray animals. I am participating in a county-approved wildlife management program run by the Desert Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The cats are part of a trap, neuter return program. They are all vaccinated, fixed, and registered. I have all the permits and documentation here." I walked forward and placed copies on the table in front of each board member. Patricia did not touch hers. "The county has approved this program," I continued. "State law protects participation in wildlife management programs. The HOA cannot fine me for following state and county law." Harold, the balding man, picked up the papers and started flipping through them. "This looks pretty official," he muttered. Patricia cut him off. "The covenants are clear. No feeding of animals that are not household pets. It does not matter what program he claims to be part of." "The rules apply to everyone." "But he just said it is protected by state law," Craig interjected. "We cannot enforce rules that violate state law, can we?" "That is a matter for our attorney to decide," Patricia snapped. "The board has made its decision. The fine stands." I felt anger rising in my chest but forced myself to stay calm. "With all due respect, your attorney is wrong. I have my own attorney now, and she has made it very clear that you cannot prohibit this. I am not backing down, and I am not paying this fine." Patricia finally looked directly at me, her eyes cold. "Then we will see you in court, Mr. Quinn. This meeting is adjourned." The board members looked uncomfortable, except for Patricia, who gathered her papers and walked out without another word. Craig lingered for a moment, catching my eye and giving me an apologetic shrug before following the others out. I sat back down in the folding chair, my heart pounding. The 3 other residents who had been in the room were staring at me with wide eyes. One of them, an older woman with gray hair, leaned over. "Good for you," she whispered. "Someone needs to stand up to her." I drove home feeling shaken but resolved. This was going to be a fight, but I was not going to let Patricia and her board push me around. The next few weeks were a blur of legal correspondence. Michelle filed a motion to dismiss the fine, and the HOA's attorney responded with increasingly absurd arguments. At one point, Fitzgerald actually tried to claim that the cats posed a health risk to the community, despite all the veterinary records showing they were vaccinated and healthy. Dr. Chen from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was a rock throughout the process. She provided affidavits, expert testimony, and even reached out to county officials to document the HOA's interference. The county's Animal Services Department sent a formal letter to the HOA board stating that they were in violation of county ordinances by attempting to prohibit the feeding program. But Patricia would not budge. The case went to mediation in early February. Michelle and I met with Patricia, her attorney, and a mediator at a law office in downtown Phoenix. The meeting was supposed to last 2 hours. It took 4. Patricia spent most of the time arguing that the HOA had absolute authority over community standards. Michelle patiently explained, multiple times, that this was not true. The mediator, a retired judge named Thompson, looked increasingly frustrated as the session wore on. Finally, Judge Thompson turned to Patricia directly. "Mrs. Morrison, I have reviewed all the documentation. Mr. Quinn is participating in a legitimate, county-approved program. You do not have the legal authority to fine him for this. If this goes to court, you will lose, and the HOA will likely be responsible for his legal fees as well as potential damages." Patricia's face flushed red. "This is about maintaining community standards. If we allow one person to break the rules, where does it end?" "He is not breaking the rules," the mediator said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "He is following state and county law which supersedes your covenants. I strongly suggest you withdraw the fine and update your covenants to reflect current law." But Patricia refused. She stood up, announced that the HOA would not be backing down, and walked out of the mediation. Her attorney looked embarrassed and apologized to Michelle before following Patricia out. Judge Thompson shook his head. "I have been doing this for 30 years, and I have never seen such stubbornness. I am sorry, Mr. Quinn. You are going to have to take this to court." Michelle filed a lawsuit the following week. We were not just seeking dismissal of the fine anymore. We were also asking for damages, legal fees, and an injunction preventing the HOA from interfering with the feeding program. Dr. Chen and the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center joined as co-plaintiffs, arguing that the HOA's actions were disrupting a vital conservation program. The case attracted local media attention. A reporter from the Arizona Republic wrote an article about it, framing it as a story about an overreaching HOA battling a wildlife conservation volunteer. The story went semi-viral on social media, and suddenly, I was getting messages from people all over the state sharing their own HOA horror stories. Patricia did not like the attention. At the next HOA board meeting, which I did not attend but heard about from Craig, who emailed me afterwards, she went on a rant about how outside agitators were trying to undermine the community. She claimed I had manufactured the whole situation to make the HOA look bad. But the negative publicity was having an effect. Several homeowners in the community reached out to me expressing support. A petition started circulating calling for Patricia to resign as HOA president. The other board members were reportedly getting nervous about the potential legal costs if the case went all the way to trial. In late March, something unexpected happened. I was out in my backyard doing the evening feeding when I heard shouting from the wash behind my property. I walked over to investigate and found Patricia herself, standing about 50 feet away, taking pictures of me with her phone. "What are you doing?" I called out. "Documenting your illegal activity," she shouted back. "You are not going to get away with this." "I am not doing anything illegal," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "You are the one who is trespassing. This is private property." "The wash is community property," Patricia shot back, though I was pretty sure she was wrong about that. One of the cats, a large orange tabby named Rusty by the center volunteers, walked past me toward his food bowl. Patricia's eyes widened. "That thing is huge," she said, her voice rising. "That is not a domestic cat. That is probably feral and dangerous." "He is part of the program," I said. "He is fixed, vaccinated, and completely harmless. He has been living in this area for years." Patricia took more pictures, her hands shaking. "We will see what animal control has to say about this." She turned and marched away, nearly tripping over a rock in her haste. I stood there watching her go, feeling a mix of frustration and concern. Was she actually going to call animal control? She did. 2 days later, an animal control officer showed up at my door. He was a younger guy named Officer Ramirez, and he looked apologetic from the moment I opened the door. "Mr. Quinn, I am here about a complaint regarding feral animals on your property." I invited him in and explained the entire situation. I showed him all my documentation from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, the county permits, everything. Officer Ramirez nodded along, taking notes. "Yeah, I am familiar with the center's program," he said. "We work with them regularly. You are not doing anything wrong. Honestly, someone from my office should have coordinated with your HOA before the program expanded into this area. That is our fault. So there is no issue." "No issue at all from our perspective," Officer Ramirez confirmed. "I will file a report stating that you are in full compliance with county regulations. That should help with your lawsuit." After he left, I called Michelle to update her. She was thrilled. "That is perfect," she said. "It completely undermines their case. They cannot claim you are violating animal control ordinances when animal control themselves confirms you are in compliance." The court date was set for late April. As it approached, the HOA's attorney reached out to Michelle with a settlement offer. They would drop the fine if I agreed to stop feeding the cats and sign a document saying I would not sue the HOA for damages. I did not even have to think about it. "No," I told Michelle. "They started this. They can see it through." The trial was held at the Maricopa County Superior Court in downtown Phoenix. It was a bench trial, meaning just a judge and no jury. Our judge was named Victoria Hernandez, a woman in her 50s with a reputation for no-nonsense rulings. Michelle presented our case methodically. She entered all the documentation from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center into evidence, showed the permits, and played portions of video depositions from Dr. Chen and Officer Ramirez. She cited case law showing that HOAs could not enforce covenants that contradicted state or county law. The HOA's attorney, Fitzgerald, tried to argue that the covenants were a private contract and should be upheld regardless of outside programs. He claimed that allowing this exception would set a dangerous precedent that would undermine HOA authority throughout the state. Judge Hernandez listened patiently to both sides, occasionally asking pointed questions. When Fitzgerald argued that the cats posed a potential health risk, she stopped him. "Counselor, all the evidence shows these animals are vaccinated and monitored by licensed veterinarians. What specific health risk are you claiming?" Fitzgerald stammered for a moment before falling back on vague concerns about property values and community standards. The judge was not impressed. After 2 days of testimony and arguments, Judge Hernandez took a brief recess to review the evidence. When she returned, her ruling was swift and decisive. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff," she announced. "Mr. Quinn is participating in a county-approved wildlife management program that serves a legitimate conservation purpose. The HOA's covenants cannot prohibit activity that is protected by state and county law. The fine is dismissed, and the HOA is ordered to cease any interference with Mr. Quinn's participation in the program." I felt relief wash over me, but Judge Hernandez was not done. "Furthermore," she continued, "the court finds that the HOA acted in bad faith by continuing to pursue this matter after being repeatedly informed of the legal protections for Mr. Quinn's activities. The HOA is ordered to pay Mr. Quinn's legal fees in full, as well as nominal damages in the amount of $5,000. Additionally, the court will issue an injunction preventing the HOA from retaliating against Mr. Quinn in any way." Michelle squeezed my arm, grinning. Across the courtroom, Patricia sat rigid in her chair, her face pale. Fitzgerald looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. The ruling made local news again. The Arizona Republic ran a follow-up article with the headline "Judge Rules Against HOA in Cat Feeding Dispute." The comments section was overwhelmingly supportive, with dozens of people sharing their own negative HOA experiences. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. About a week after the ruling, I got an email from Craig, the young board member. He had decided to run against Patricia for HOA president in the upcoming election and wanted my support. He explained that several other homeowners were also fed up with Patricia's authoritarian management style, and they saw this as an opportunity for change. I agreed to help however I could. Over the next few weeks, I attended community meetings, talked to neighbors, and shared my story with anyone who would listen. The election was held in early June, and the turnout was unprecedented for an HOA vote. Usually, only about 20% of homeowners bothered to submit ballots. This time, over 60% participated. Craig won by a landslide. Patricia was not just voted out as president, she was removed from the board entirely. 3 of her allies also lost their seats. It was a complete repudiation of her leadership. The new board, led by Craig, immediately got to work reforming the HOA's approach. They updated the covenants to explicitly allow participation in county-approved wildlife programs. They also implemented new procedures requiring the board to consult with legal experts before issuing fines for anything that might be protected by law. It was not a revolution, but it was progress. Patricia, meanwhile, seemed to vanish from neighborhood life. I would occasionally see her coming or going from her house, but she never made eye contact. Her white Mercedes disappeared from daily patrols around the community. I heard through the grapevine that she and her husband were thinking about selling and moving to a different community, though I never confirmed if that actually happened. But the story took one more unexpected turn in late July. I was doing my evening feeding routine when Dr. Chen called me with urgent news. "Isaac, we have a problem," she said, her voice tight with stress. "We just found out that someone has been poisoning cats in your area. 3 of them from your colony are dead." My heart dropped. "What? Who would do that?" "We do not know yet. We have reported it to animal control and the police. Poisoning animals is a felony in Arizona, but I need you to be careful. Check the feeding area before you put food out. Do not touch anything suspicious." I walked carefully to the feeding station, my phone's flashlight illuminating the ground. At first, everything looked normal. Then I saw it. Several chunks of what looked like meat scattered near the bowls. They had not been there yesterday. I took pictures and called Dr. Chen back. "There is suspicious food here," I told her. "I am not going to touch it, but it looks wrong." "I am calling animal control right now," she said. "Do not let any cats near it." Officer Ramirez arrived within 30 minutes, now accompanied by a detective from the Phoenix Police Department. They collected the suspicious meat as evidence and set up a small camera pointed at the feeding area. "We are taking this very seriously," the detective, a woman named Detective Martinez, told me. "Animal cruelty cases often escalate to violence against people. We want to catch whoever is doing this before it gets worse." Over the next few days, Dr. Chen and I coordinated to temporarily relocate the remaining cats from my area to a different feeding station while the investigation continued. It was heartbreaking work. These cats had established routines, and disrupting them caused obvious stress. The police worked fast. It turned out the camera they installed caught something on the very first night. A figure approaching the feeding area around midnight and scattering what looked like the same type of meat chunks. Detective Martinez called me a week later with an update that I should have seen coming but still shocked me. "We have identified the person," she said. "It is Patricia Morrison, your former HOA president." I stood in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, trying to process what I was hearing. "You are sure?" "Positive. The camera footage is clear. We also found receipts in her trash for the type of meat used, along with a commercial rat poison that matches what was in the samples. We are executing a search warrant at her house this afternoon. Patricia was arrested that evening. The charges were multiple counts of animal cruelty, a Class 5 felony in Arizona. If convicted, she could face up to 2 years in prison and substantial fines. The arrest made bigger news than anything else related to the HOA dispute. Local TV stations ran stories about the HOA president accused of poisoning cats. The story went beyond local coverage this time, picked up by national news outlets and going viral on social media. People were outraged, not just at the cruelty, but at the pettiness that drove someone to commit a felony over an HOA dispute they had already lost. Patricia's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the county attorney's office was not interested in being lenient. Animal cruelty cases had become a priority, and the deliberate poisoning of animals enrolled in a county program made it even worse. The trial was held in September. I testified about the ongoing dispute with Patricia and the HOA. Dr. Chen provided expert testimony about the harm done to the cat colony and the broader conservation program. The evidence was overwhelming. Video footage, purchase receipts, forensic analysis of the poison. The jury took less than 3 hours to return a guilty verdict on all counts. Patricia was sentenced to 18 months in prison, with the possibility of parole after 9 months. She was also ordered to pay restitution to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center for the costs of relocating and treating the surviving cats, which came to over $15,000. Additionally, she was permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in Arizona. I attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom. When the judge read the sentence, Patricia finally broke down, sobbing into her hands while her husband sat stone-faced beside her. I did not feel triumphant watching it. Mostly, I just felt sad that things had escalated so far over something so simple. Life in Sunridge Springs gradually returned to normal after that. The cats came back to their regular feeding station once the police cleared the area. The new HOA board proved to be reasonable and focused on actual community issues rather than petty enforcement of arbitrary rules. Craig even volunteered to help with the feeding program occasionally, saying it was a good way to unwind after work. I continued my evening routine, putting out food for the cats at 6 o'clock every night. Rusty, the big orange tabby who had survived the poisoning attempt, became especially friendly, sometimes sitting near me while he ate. I never tried to pet him or domesticate him. That was not the point of the program, but there was something peaceful about his presence. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center expanded its program into 3 more neighborhoods in the area, and Dr. Chen told me that my case had actually helped by raising awareness. Several other HOAs proactively updated their rules to accommodate wildlife programs after seeing what happened with Patricia and Sunridge Springs. I also became something of an accidental advocate for HOA reform. I was invited to speak at a few community meetings in other neighborhoods, sharing my experience and encouraging people to stand up to unreasonable board members. A local advocacy group even asked me to help draft model legislation that would provide clearer protections for homeowners participating in county-approved programs. As summer turned to fall, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. What started as a simple act of compassion, feeding cats as part of a conservation program, had turned into a months-long legal battle and ultimately exposed a level of vindictiveness I had not known existed. But it also showed me the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult and expensive. If I had just paid that first $500 fine and stopped feeding the cats, Patricia would still be terrorizing the neighborhood, the HOA would still be overstepping its authority, and the cats would have lost a vital food source. Instead, the community was better, the law was clarified, and a genuine wildlife conservation program was able to continue its important work. One evening in October, I was sitting on my back patio watching the sunset over the desert landscape. The cats had finished their dinner and dispersed back into the wash. Rusty was the last to leave, pausing at the edge of my yard to look back at me, his orange fur glowing in the fading light. My phone buzzed with a text from Michelle, my attorney who had become a friend through this whole ordeal. She was checking in to see how I was doing and mentioned she had just taken on another case, this time representing a homeowner being fined for installing solar panels that the HOA claimed violated aesthetic guidelines. I smiled and typed back my response, offering to help however I could. The fight against petty bureaucratic tyranny, it seemed, was never really over. But at least now I knew it was a fight worth having. Jerry, my neighbor who first told me about the cat colony, walked over from his yard carrying 2 beers. He had been a quiet supporter throughout the entire ordeal, even testifying on my behalf about how the cats had actually reduced the rodent problem in the neighborhood. "Thought you might want one of these," he said, handing me a cold bottle. "Thanks," I said, accepting it gratefully. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the desert sky turn from orange to purple to deep blue. The temperature was finally starting to drop as autumn settled into Arizona. "You know," Jerry finally said, "I have lived in this neighborhood for 10 years. Before you moved in, everyone just kind of accepted whatever the HOA said. Nobody questioned anything. Patricia ran the place like her personal fiefdom, and we all just went along with it." "Why did not anyone push back?" I asked. Jerry shrugged. "Easier not to, I guess. Nobody wants the hassle of fighting. Everybody figures it is just easier to keep your head down, follow the rules, and not make waves. But then you watch someone else get pushed around and you realize you are part of the problem by not speaking up." "You did speak up," I pointed out. "Your testimony helped. Only after you had already done the hard part," Jerry said. "You fought when it would have been so much easier to just give up. That takes guts." We finished our beers as the stars started appearing overhead. The desert night was alive with sounds. Crickets chirping, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush. This was what the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was working to protect, this ecosystem that existed alongside our suburban development. The next morning, I received an email from the county government. They were creating a new advisory board to help coordinate wildlife management programs with HOAs throughout the area, and they wanted me to serve on it. The goal was to prevent situations like mine from happening again by proactively educating HOA boards about what they could and could not legally restrict. I agreed immediately. It felt like a way to turn all the stress and frustration of the past year into something constructive. The first meeting of the advisory board was held in November at the County Administrative Building in downtown Phoenix. There were about 15 of us, representatives from various wildlife organizations, a few county officials, a couple of HOA board members from communities that had been cooperative, and 3 other homeowners who had faced situations similar to mine. Dr. Chen was there as the representative from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. She gave me a warm hug when she saw me. "I am so glad you agreed to do this," she said. "Your experience and perspective are invaluable. Most people do not understand how difficult it can be to do conservation work in suburban areas. You have lived it." The meeting was productive. We discussed best practices for communication between wildlife organizations and HOAs, drafted guidelines for what restrictions were legally permissible, and created educational materials that could be distributed to HOA boards throughout the county. One of the county officials, a woman named Samantha who worked in the planning department, raised an interesting point during the discussion. "We need to think bigger than just wildlife feeding," she said. "HOAs are increasingly regulating all kinds of environmental activities. We have seen disputes over native plant landscaping, rainwater collection, solar panels, composting. There needs to be clear guidance about what is protected activity and what is legitimately within the HOA's purview." That led to a broader conversation about HOA authority and environmental conservation. It turned out there was a lot of frustration in the conservation community about HOAs blocking or discouraging sustainable practices in the name of aesthetic uniformity. By the end of the meeting, we had outlined an ambitious project, creating comprehensive guidelines for Arizona HOAs that would balance community standards with environmental conservation and sustainability. It would take months of work, but everyone in the room was committed to making it happen. As I drove home that evening, I thought about how strange and unpredictable life could be. A year ago, I was just a guy who worked from home and kept to himself. Now, I was involved in county advisory boards and helping to shape policy that would affect thousands of homeowners. All because I had fed some cats. December brought cooler weather to Phoenix, relatively speaking. The evening temperatures dropped into the 50s, which felt almost cold after the brutal summer heat. I started wearing a light jacket for my evening feeding routine. The cat colony had stabilized after the trauma of the poisoning incident. All the surviving cats were healthy, and Dr. Chen told me they had successfully trapped and neutered 2 new cats that had wandered into the area. The population was being maintained at a sustainable level, and the program was working exactly as intended. I got a letter in December from Patricia's attorney. She was out on bail pending her appeal, though everyone seemed to think the appeal would fail given the overwhelming evidence. The letter was strange, a rambling attempt at an apology that still tried to justify her actions. She claimed she had been under tremendous stress and had not been thinking clearly. She said she had never meant to actually hurt the cats, which was absurd given that she had deliberately poisoned them. I did not respond to the letter. There was nothing to say. Some things could not be forgiven with words, especially when someone had shown such calculated cruelty. I hoped she would get help while in prison, but that was not my responsibility. Christmas came and went quietly. I flew back to Michigan to spend a week with my family, catching up with my parents and siblings. They had followed the whole saga through my phone calls and news articles, and they were simultaneously proud and horrified by what I had been through. "You always were stubborn," my mother said over Christmas dinner. "Even as a kid, if you thought something was unfair, you would not let it go." "Is that a compliment or a criticism?" I asked, smiling. "Both," she said, laughing. "It is a quality that can cause you a lot of trouble, but it also means you stand up for things that matter. I am proud of you, honey." When I returned to Arizona in early January, there was good news waiting. The county had officially adopted the guidelines our advisory board had been working on. They would be distributed to every HOA in Maricopa County, along with educational materials about wildlife conservation programs and environmental sustainability initiatives. Craig, the new HOA president, was one of the first to implement the guidelines in Sunridge Springs. At the January board meeting, they voted to update the community covenants to explicitly protect a wide range of conservation activities. The changes would have to be approved by a vote of the full membership, but Craig was confident they would pass. People are tired of the old way of doing things, he told me over coffee one Saturday morning. They want a community that feels like a community, not a dictatorship. The stuff with Patricia really opened people's eyes. The membership vote was held in February, and the new covenants passed with over 70% approval. It was a remarkable turnaround for a community that had been so tightly controlled just a year earlier. Spring arrived in the desert with an explosion of wildflowers. The heavy winter rains had set up ideal conditions, and the landscape around Sunridge Springs was covered in gold poppies, purple lupines, and red fairy dusters. It was stunning, a reminder of why I had moved to Arizona in the first place. The cat colony was thriving. Rusty had become something of a neighborhood mascot, with several residents asking about him during my evening feeding sessions. A few other neighbors had even started volunteering with the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, expanding the program's capacity. In April, I got a call from a producer at a national news magazine show. They wanted to do a feature story about HOA overreach and thought my case would be a good example. I was hesitant at first, worried about the exposure, but Michelle encouraged me to do it. "Your story helps people understand these issues," she said, "and it might prevent someone else from going through what you went through." I agreed, and the producers flew out to Phoenix in May. They filmed me doing the evening feeding, interviewed me extensively about the case, and also talked to Dr. Chen, Michelle, Craig, and even Officer Ramirez. They also tried to interview Patricia, but she declined. The segment aired in June and was longer than I expected, nearly 15 minutes. They did a good job telling the story, focusing on the broader issues of HOA authority and individual rights, rather than just the sensational elements of the cat poisoning. The response was overwhelming. My email and social media inboxes flooded with messages from people all over the country sharing their own HOA horror stories. Many of them were looking for advice or encouragement to fight back against unreasonable restrictions in their own communities. I tried to respond to as many as I could, offering whatever guidance I could based on my experience. Michelle also started getting calls from people across Arizona who needed representation in HOA disputes. The publicity had turned her into something of a specialist in this area of law. Patricia's appeal was denied in July. She would serve her full sentence, though she would be eligible for parole in a few months. I wondered what she would do when she got out, whether she would stay in the neighborhood or leave. Either way, her days of wielding power over the community were over. August marked 1 year since my legal battle with the HOA had concluded. The anniversary got some local media coverage, with reporters checking in to see how things had turned out. I was happy to report that everything was going well. The cat colony was healthy, the neighborhood was peaceful, and the new HOA board was actually functioning as a helpful organization rather than an authoritarian nightmare. Dr. Chen invited me to speak at a conference for wildlife rehabilitators in September. I shared my story with an audience of about 200 people from across the Southwest, focusing on the challenges of doing conservation work in suburban areas and the importance of understanding HOA law. The response was enthusiastic. Many of the attendees had faced similar problems with HOAs, and they appreciated hearing about a case where pushing back had actually worked. Several of them asked for Michelle's contact information, and a few exchanged numbers with me to stay in touch. In October, I received notice that Patricia had been released on parole after serving 9 months. I saw her once, getting into a moving truck outside her house with her husband. She looked older and smaller somehow, diminished by everything that had happened. Our eyes met briefly across the street. She looked away quickly, climbing into the truck's passenger seat. I never saw her again. As autumn settled in and the temperature became pleasant again, I found myself reflecting on the entire journey. What had started as a simple act of kindness, feeding cats as part of a conservation program, had spiraled into a legal battle, a criminal case, policy changes, and a level of public attention I had never wanted or expected. But through it all, the core mission had remained the same: protecting animals that needed help and supporting conservation work in an increasingly developed landscape. That part had never changed, even when everything else was chaos. The cats still came to eat every evening at 6. Rusty still lingered after the others left, keeping me company as the sun set. The desert still came alive at night with the sounds of wildlife adapting to live alongside human development. And every evening, as I put out the food provided by the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, I felt satisfied knowing I had done the right thing. Not the easy thing, not the convenient thing, but the right thing. That was worth all the hassle, all the legal fees, and all the stress. Standing up to bullies and protecting those who could not protect themselves was always worth it. The HOA had tried to fine me for feeding stray cats, not understanding or caring that those cats belonged to a legitimate wildlife rehabilitation program. They had escalated a simple misunderstanding into a legal battle they were always going to lose. And when they lost, one person had taken it so personally that she committed felonies in retaliation. But in the end, the system worked. The courts protected my rights, the police held Patricia accountable for her crimes, and the community reformed itself into something better. Jerry and I still shared beers on my back patio occasionally, watching the desert sunset and talking about life. Craig had become a friend, someone I could count on for reasonable conversation, and occasionally help with minor home repairs. The advisory board continued to meet quarterly, refining our guidelines and expanding our outreach to HOA communities. The work was slow but important, changing culture one community at a time, and through it all, the cats kept coming. Not strays, not pests, but part of a managed colony serving an important ecological function. They were thriving because people cared enough to do the hard work of conservation. Even in suburban Phoenix, even when faced with opposition from petty bureaucrats who could not see past their own authority. That was the real story, not the conflict with Patricia or the legal battles, but the quiet success of a conservation program that worked because people refused to give up on it. As winter approached again, bringing another round of pleasant weather to the Valley of the Sun, I stood in my backyard watching Rusty eat his evening meal. The big orange cat looked up at me, his green eyes reflecting the porch light, and for a moment we just regarded each other. Then he went back to his food and I went back to my house, satisfied with another day's work done. Another small victory in the ongoing effort to make the world a little bit better than I found it. The HOA had tried to stop me, but they had failed. And in failing, they had made the cause stronger. Sometimes that is how change happens, not through grand gestures but through ordinary people refusing to back down when they know they are right. I was just a guy who fed some cats, but that had been enough.